Today is what, September? It's still September 28. Okay. That's the Sutta, yeah. Okay, so you don't have the book? Maybe if each one sits next to a person who has the book, then you can look on together. Okay, so we're going to start first with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa, namo tassa. Excuse me, I have to get the right rhythm. Namo tassa bhagavata. Namo tassa. I keep on falling into the Sri Lankan way of doing it. Will somebody remind me how I recite? To arahato samma sambuddhassa. No, that's the Sri Lankan way. Arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. But that's the typical Sri Lankan way, no? How have I been doing it for the last 10 years? Okay, so today we're taking Sutta number 108. In the middle-length discourses, this is called the Gopaka-Moggallana Sutta. And this sutta is somewhat interesting because it takes place very shortly after the passing away of the Buddha. And so the sutta shows us how I call it the newly orphaned Sangha, had to deal with problems that would have arisen without having the supreme authority of the Buddha to always turn to for advice and guidance. Okay, so the sutta begins with, it says, "Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Venerable Ananda was living at Rajagaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrel sanctuary, not long after the Blessed One had attained final Nibbana." Okay, so according to the commentary, this sutta actually opens at a time when the Sangha has been gathering at Rajagaha in order to hold what came to be called the first Buddhist council. That is the first attempt of the Sangha to collect into some kind of formal arrangement the teachings of the Buddha. And so this sutta will open at the time that Ananda has arrived at Rajagaha in order to participate in the council. But apparently the council had not yet started, because if it had started, then Ananda would have been not in the bamboo grove, but he would have been at the place where the council was being conducted. That's the Boar's Cave. Okay, then the sutta, the next paragraph, gives us another sort of spotlight on a historical development of the period. It says, now on that occasion, King Ajatasattu Vaidehi-Putta of Magadha was suspicious of King Pujota, and therefore he was having Rajagaha fortified. Okay, so who was this King Ajatasattu? He was the son of King Bimbisara, and King Bimbisara was one of the first lay supporters of the Buddha. In fact, according to the sutta that occurs in the Sutta Nipata, even before the Buddha was enlightened, when he had left the Sakyan Republic and had come to the state of Magadha as a seeker of the truth, a seeker of enlightenment, he was walking on alms, going on alms round. He was living outside of Rajagaha, and he would go on alms round through the city of Rajagaha. And one day, as the Bodhisattva, that is the future Buddha, was walking on alms through Rajagaha, King Bimbisara was in his palace, and he spotted the Bodhisattva down below on his alms round, and he was immediately impressed by the very calm and majestic demeanor of this ascetic. And so he asked his men to follow, some of his servants, to follow the Bodhisattva and find out where he was going. And so they traced him back to the cave where he was living and meditating. And King Bimbisara came to visit him. And King Bimbisara asked him about his background, because he thought that this, from his appearance, from his demeanor, that he couldn't be just an ordinary run-of-the-mill ascetic, but he must come from very high-bred family, high-class family. And so the Bodhisattva told him that he was from the Sakyan clan, which was a highly respected clan, that he was from the aristocracy of that clan, but that he had renounced the world in order to seek enlightenment. And I think King Bimbisara, if I remember, tried to prevail on him to give up this quest for truth and to become, to marry into his own family, offering him part of the kingdom to rule. But of course the Bodhisattva firmly rejected that and expressed his determination to continue on his quest for the truth. So then King Bimbisara made a request of the Buddha. He requested him that if you succeed and you achieve enlightenment, then please come to see me and accept me as your disciple and teach me the truth that you've realized. Teach me the Dhamma. And then he made an aspiration, may I partake of the truth that you realize. In other words, may I share in that realization. Okay, so perhaps years later, when the Buddha attained enlightenment, of course he would remember that promise that he made to King Bimbisara. And so he came to see King Bimbisara, and King Bimbisara became his disciple and offered him the bamboo grove. So the bamboo grove in Rajagaha was originally a gift from King Bimbisara to the Buddha. And then when the Buddha, after he accepted the bamboo grove, then he gave a discourse to King Bimbisara, and King Bimbisara became a Sotapanna. That is, he became a stream enterer, so he realized the first stage of enlightenment under the Buddha. Okay, many years later, The Buddha had a pupil, a disciple who came from the Sakya clan. We usually take the musical interlude halfway through. Okay, so the Buddha had a disciple or a pupil who came from the Sakya clan named Devadatta. And Devadatta had succeeded, I think when his early days as a monk, he was very diligent, and so he must have attained the jhanas, the meditative absorptions. Then on the basis of the jhanas, he achieved psychic powers, supernormal powers. Now Devadatta became, even though he might have been quite diligent and sincere when in his early years as a monk, but he was what one would call a bad seed. That is, he had a very bad streak in his character. He was ambitious, jealous, competitive, and over time, his aim, sort of the aim that solidified in his mind, was to get control of the Buddhist order. He knew that the Buddha was getting old, and he thought that in time the Buddha is going to need somebody to take his place. And so first, he tried to ingratiate himself to the Buddha by doing little acts of kindness and little acts of service to the Buddha. And when he thought that he had won the Buddha's favor, then he said, "Bhante, you're getting old now. We have a nice kuti for you. You take it easy. We bring you your meals. You don't have to give discourses anymore. Don't have to give teachings to the Sangha anymore. I'll take over for you." But the Buddha knew Devadatta was being driven by greed and ambition and lust for power. So he said, "No, I'm not going to give the Sangha to you." Okay, so Devadatta had a scheme took shape in his mind that he was going to try to use royal influence to get rid of the Buddha. But how could he use royal influence when the king of Magadha was Bimbisara, his pupil, his devotee, one who had already reached the first stage of enlightenment? And so Devadatta thought the way to get royal support is to knock out Bimbisara and replace him with somebody else. And who is next in the line of succession? Bimbisara's son, Ajatasattu. And so Devadatta used his psychic powers to come into the living quarters of King Ajatasattu. He came in the shape of a young boy. Then he manifested himself in the form of a young boy with a kind of number of cobras sort of wrapped around his body, swirling around his body. And so Prince Ajatasattu was frightened, and he was wondering, what is this? Who is this? This young boy who just out of nowhere slips into the palace with all of these cobras wound around his body. So then Devadatta, when he saw Prince Ajatasattu, was afraid. He manifested his actual form as Devadatta and said, Ajatasattu, don't be afraid, I am Devadatta. Okay, so in this way, in a number of ways, Devadatta won the favor, the respect, the admiration of Prince Ajatasattu. And then when he knew that Ajatasattu had now trust in him and had become devoted to him, then he made a suggestion to Ajatasattu. You know, this is a case of, there's a saying, birds of a feather flock together. So Devadatta must have had a keen insight into the character of Ajatasattu. So he said to him, Ajatasattu, when are you going to become king? And Ajatasattu said, well, when my father passes away. Then Devadatta said, you know, that could be years. You're going to wait years to become king? Ajatasattu said, well, that's the way it is. You know, one has to wait till the king dies. And when the king dies, then I take over. But then Devadatta said, well, I have a better idea. Why don't you get rid of the king? Then, you know, you get rid of him and you can become king right away. You don't have to, you know, take that chance, you know, waiting 10 years maybe. Okay, so then he planted this idea in Ajatasattu's mind, and so Ajatasattu took over the kingship. He imprisoned his father Bimbisara, and then he had Bimbisara tortured. He cut off the food supply to Bimbisara so that Bimbisara gradually was starving. And then to hasten the process, I think he had him roasted on hot coals. So Bimbisara died and Ajatasattu became king. Okay, after Ajatasattu became king, it's said that at a certain point he felt remorse over killing his father, and then he went to the Buddha. He received a discourse from the Buddha, which is the second sutta in the Digha Nikaya, the discourse on the fruits of recluseship, the Samanyapala Sutta. At the end of the discourse, Ajatasattu confessed that he had killed his father, the virtuous king Bimbisara, and he declared himself a pupil of the Buddha. He went for the refuge, and seemingly, well, he declared that he went for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I was going to say he undertook the 5 precepts, but from aspects of his behavior afterwards, I'm a bit doubtful about that. Okay, now the text mentions King Ajatasattu, who is the king of the large and powerful state of Magadha, and it also mentions another king, Pajota, who was the king of a country to the southwest of Magadha, some distance away, called Avanti. And now King Pajota was, during the lifetime of Bimbisara, King Pajota had established a friendship with King Bimbisara. He established the friendship because King Pajota had been suffering from a terrible headache, and none of his own physicians was able to cure it. And so he sent a message. He had heard that King Bimbisara had an outstanding physician named Jivaka. And so he sent a message to King Bimbisara asking him if he would send Jivaka to Avanti in order to treat him. And so King Bimbisara granted this request. He sent Jivaka, Dr. Jivaka, to Avanti, and Jivaka cured King Pajota of this terrible headache. And so in this way, King Pajota felt a deep sense of gratitude to King Bimbisara, and the two established a friendship. And so when King Bajota heard that Ajatasattu had killed his good friend, King Bimbisara, his own father, then he started to make plans to attack the kingdom of Magadha in order to take revenge, either to capture Ajatasattu or to kill him. And so these reports had been spreading, and word about them had reached Ajatasattu. And so now Ajatasattu was having Rajagaha fortified. So this is sort of the historical background to the sutta. Okay, now continuing, now we come back from the conflicts of states, the ambitions of kings, murder, war, and so on, back to the peaceful life of a monk like Venerable Ananda, who now gets dressed early in the morning and takes his bowl and goes towards Rajagaha for alms. But as he's approaching Rajagaha, he thinks it's too early to walk for alms in the city, and so he decides to go to see the Brahmin named Gopaka-Moggallana at his workplace. And this strikes me a little bit strange, because we have a Brahmin at a workplace. And I believe, according to the commentary, Gopaka-Moggallana was like a master craftsman who was helping to build the fortifications at his workplace that would be used to fortify the city of Rajagaha. Okay, in any case, Ananda approaches the workplace of Gopaka-Moggallana, and I'll just refer to him for simplicity's sake as Gopaka. And Gopaka welcomes him. Apparently they've met on previous occasions, since Gopaka says that it's been long since Master Ananda has found an opportunity to come here. Okay, then when Ananda is seated, then Gopaka, the Brahmin Gopaka, asks Ananda a question. He asks him, is there, I'm in paragraph 5 now, is there any single bhikkhu who possesses in each and every way all those qualities that were possessed by Master Gotama, who is the accomplished one, that's the Arahat, the fully enlightened one, the Samma Sambuddha? And then Ananda replies that there is no single bhikkhu who possesses in each and every way all those qualities that were possessed by the Blessed One, the fully enlightened one. And then Ananda highlights the way in which the Buddha stood out from amongst the entire community of monks. He says, for the Blessed One was the arouser, the one who gave rise to the path that had not been arisen before. He was the one who produced or created the path that had not been created before. He was the one who declared the path that hadn't been declared the path. He was the knower of the path, the finder of the path, the one skilled in the path. But his disciples now dwell following that path and become possessed of it afterwards.
But there were other Buddhas previously.
Yeah, there were other Buddhas previously.
So the path was realized, he just realized it in our...
Yeah, we could say in our historical period, yeah. Okay, so this passage, if we take a look at it, it seems to be saying that the way in which the Buddha sort of stood out from all of the other monks was simply in being the one who discovered and proclaimed the path on his own without receiving it, or without receiving instructions about it from any previous teacher. And there's another sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya which also which also corresponds very closely to this passage. And that sutta is sutta number, it's in chapter 22, the chapter on the 5 aggregates. It's sutta number 58. And this sutta says, in brief, it says that the Tathagata, the Arahat, the fully enlightened one, is one who has become dispassionate towards form, feeling, towards the 5 aggregates, form, feeling, perception, volitional activities, and consciousness. One who's become dispassionate towards them, one who's become liberated from them, one who has become dispassionate towards them, and one who has become liberated from them by non-clinging. And then the Buddha says, a monk who is an arhat is one who has also become disenchanted with the 5 aggregates, dispassionate towards them, and liberated from them by non-clinging. And so, in the sutta, the Buddha says, what is the difference? What is the distinction? What is the disparity between a monk who's an arhat and the Tathagata, the fully enlightened one? And then the answer that is given in that sutta is exactly the same statement as we find here, that the Buddha is one who arouses the unarisen path and so on, who's the knower, the finder, the one skilled in the path, whereas the monk who's an arhat is one who follows the path and then has become possessed of it afterwards. And so if one just sticks to those suttas, it would seem that the difference between the Buddha and an enlightened disciple is simply priority of attainment. But in my view, like if we take a more panoramic look at the canon or at the suttas, we find that there are suttas which ascribe to the Buddha qualities which are not held in common with disciples. And so these would be what I would call the distinctive characteristics or the exclusive characteristics of the Buddha. And so amongst them we find in Sutta number 12 in the Majjhima Nikaya, we find one set of qualities is called the 10 Tathagata powers, the 10 powers of a fully enlightened one, by which the Buddha is able to set rolling the wheel of Dharma. So it's through these powers that the Buddha is able to set in motion the wheel of Dharma, that is, to originate the teaching in a historical period where it doesn't exist, in which he's able to teach people of many different inclinations, tendencies, dispositions, modes of understanding. And so these 10 powers, well, I don't want to really get into them now. Some of them are held in common by disciples, and maybe disciples will have some of the others to some extent, but it's only the Buddha who has these 10 powers in their fullness. And these include the powers to know, or the ability to know the different state of the faculties of other people, to know what are their spiritual strengths, what are their spiritual weaknesses. And so on that basis, the Buddha can direct his teaching to people in order to build upon their strengths and to help them overcome their weaknesses. And again, the Buddha has a power which is called the knowledge of the inclinations and underlying tendencies of people. So on this basis, the Buddha is able, just by looking at a person, to know what are the inclinations of their mind. And so based upon their inclinations, the Buddha will give a fitting discourse. So he's able to shape the teaching to fit the interests, inclinations, dispositions of the people. And so the Buddha will, often he uses different metaphors or similes in his discourses. So those metaphors and similes can be fashioned because of the way in which the disciple or the listener can understand. For example, when speaking to a farmer, he might use the simile of a field. When speaking to a goldsmith, he might use the simile about the process of refining gold. Okay, so the Buddha has these abilities to know, with depth, to know the inclinations, tendencies, faculties of others, and to direct, to fashion his teaching, to fit their modes of understanding, their inclinations, their weaknesses and potential strengths. The Buddha also has a comprehensive knowledge of the workings of karma. And he also knows all of the different realms of existence and which kinds of karmas, which kinds of willed actions lead to the different realms of existence. And so the Buddha has this extremely extensive knowledge, types of knowledge, which qualify him to undertake that role of being the founder of the teaching, the one who has complete mastery over all of the different avenues, the different routes of the teaching. Okay, in addition to the 10 powers of a Tathagata, the Buddha also has something called the 4 types of fearlessness, or the 4 kinds of self-confidence, which are also mentioned in the same sutta, the Lion's Roar Sutta. So that is, the Buddha has the confidence that nobody can say to him that there are certain dhammas, certain principles that he has not fully awakened to. Nobody can say to him that there are certain defilements that he has not fully eradicated. Okay, the third is that nobody can say to the Buddha that even though you say that certain things are obstacles on the path to enlightenment, that they aren't really obstacles for one who engages in them. And then the 4th ground of self-confidence is that nobody can say to the Buddha that this teaching of yours will not lead one who practices it to complete emancipation from suffering. Okay, so this is another set of distinctive qualities of the Buddha, the 4 types of fearlessness or self-confidence. Okay, but here Ananda is speaking to this Brahmin maybe in a way that he would be able to understand, also because the Brahmin has not yet or not become a disciple of the Buddha, so to speak, about the 10 grounds of self-confidence, the 10 powers, the 4 types of self-confidence, might be stretching his capacity for belief a little too far. So he mentions only the Buddha's role as being the founder, the discoverer of the path, and the finder and teacher of the path. Okay, now as the two are carrying on this conversation, somebody else arrives on the scene This is a Brahmin named Vasakara, who was the chief minister of the state of Magadha, which means that he was in fact the chief minister under Ajatasattu. So we could say he's Ajatasattu's right-hand man. And it said that he was supervising the work at Rajagaha. Like he was the one who was overseeing this project of building new fortifications for Rajagaha. So maybe he had come to check up on the work of Gopaka to see that he's progressing in building the fortifications. Okay, so when Vasakara comes on the scene, after exchanging greetings with Ananda, then he asks what was the discussion that was going on here. And so Ananda reports the subject of their discussion, and then he says that this was our discussion that was interrupted when you arrived. Okay, but now the Brahmin Vasakara has some questions of his own to ask. And we have to remember now, this is a time just perhaps a month or two after the Buddha has passed away. And what's said is that when the other teachers of the period passed away, then their communities of followers broke out into quarrels, disputes, and split up into a number of subsects with differing interpretations of their master's teaching. And now everybody was sort of conjecturing and speculating, okay, now that the recluse Gautama has passed away, odds are 10 to 1 that his following is also going to split up into a number of fighting and quarreling subsects. And so I think Vasakara must have heard these reports, and so he wants to know, how is the Sangha going to maintain itself without the powerful leadership of the fully enlightened one? And so he asks Ananda, he says, is there any single monk who was appointed by Master Gautama thus, he will be your refuge when I am gone? So is there any such monk that you now rely upon as your refuge? And if you're familiar with the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, this was the sutta which reports the events that took place up to and including the passing away of the Buddha, then you might remember a passage a few months before the Buddha passed away. He got very ill, he turned very ill, and then when Ananda had observed this, after the Buddha recovered, Ananda came to the Buddha and said, when you were sick, we were all so worried. You're now 80 years old, you get sick, you can pass away. What's going to happen to us? Why don't you appoint a successor to take care of, to lead the Sangha after you have expired? Then the Buddha became very stern and he said, don't expect that I'm going to appoint a successor. There's no need for you to look up to any single individual as your guide, as your refuge. For 45 years now, I've been teaching the Dhamma. You've been getting instructions for 45 years. I've really covered every aspect of the path. It's all right down there in black and white. Well, at that time they weren't printing books. Well, you've got it all down in the corridors of your memory, and there are many learned monks who also know the teaching, learned monks, learned nuns, learned lay followers as well. So take yourself as a refuge. Be an island unto yourself. Don't look to any other refuge. And then the Buddha says, take the Dhamma as your refuge. Take the Dhamma as your island. Don't look to any other refuge. Okay, so that was about 3 months before the Buddha passed away. Then, just when the Buddha was lying on his deathbed in Kusinara, between the two sal trees, then he told, as part of his last advice to the Sangha, he said, for 45 years I've been teaching the Dhamma, I've laid down the Vinaya, that is the rules, the training, the rules of discipline. So now when I pass away, don't think earlier we had a teacher, now that he's passed away, we don't have a teacher. Even after I pass away, you still have a teacher. It is the Dhamma that has been taught by me. It is the Vinaya that has been prescribed by me. That will be your teacher after I have passed away. And so in this way, the Buddha set up, almost putting in the chair of the teacher, the doctrine and the discipline, the Dhamma and the Vinaya. And so the monks, after the Buddha passed away, they continued to follow that principle. So there was no, I know that in the Zen tradition, there's a kind of a record that when the Buddha passed away, he appointed Mahakasyapa as his successor, and then there comes what's